An atheist professor at Stanford University publicly mocked Jesus Christ, but one student's calm response left the entire classroom stunned. The lecture hall buzzed with quiet conversations as students settled into their seats. Some were eager to debate, others just there for the required credit. At the front of the room stood Professor Daniel Warren, adjusting his blazer and leaning against the podium, a smirk on his face. He was notorious on campus, not just for being a philosophy professor, but for his dramatic approach to teaching. Every lecture felt like a courtroom drama, and his favorite target was religion, especially Christianity. Today's discussion was nothing new. The topic: the fallacy of faith, why religion persists in a world of science and reason. Warren paced the room, his voice thick with amusement. We live in the 21st century. We have science, medicine, space travel, yet millions still believe in a cosmic father figure who watches over us, he said. Some students chuckled, while others stayed silent. But then Warren asked the real question: why do bad things happen if this so-called loving God exists? He turned to a student in the back, Barron. The class fell silent. Barron wasn't the type to stand out, tall, lean, and quiet. But unlike others, he didn't look nervous when Warren zeroed in on him. "Tell me, Barron," Warren sneered. "You're a believer, aren't you?" "I am," Barron answered calmly, his dark eyes steady, unfazed. Professor Warren's grin widened. "Fascinating. Maybe you can help me understand something. If Jesus is real, why do bad things happen? Why hasn't he proven himself?" The room was tense. Most students braced for Barron to stumble, but he didn't. He simply sat there, his gaze locked on Warren. The silence stretched on longer than anyone expected. Finally, Warren broke it. "No answer," he said with a tap of his fingers on the podium. "That's what I thought." Some students chuckled. Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice calm. "I never said I didn't have an answer. I just don't think you're asking the right question." Warren paused for a moment, caught off guard. "Enlighten me," he said with a raised eyebrow. Barron took a breath. "You keep asking why God lets bad things happen, but what you're really asking is why doesn't he step in and fix the world? Why doesn't he stop all the suffering?" Warren's eyes lit up. "Exactly. Now we're getting somewhere." He pointed at Barron. "Let's say I'm on a train track, and a train is coming toward me. You see me, you have the power to stop it, but you don't. What does that make you?" Barron tilted his head. "Are you saying we're all tied to train tracks?" Warren smirked. "No, but if you saw someone about to get hit by a train, stopping them would be the moral thing to do, right? Because they can't stop it themselves." Barron nodded slowly. "But life isn't that simple. People have free will. If God intervened in everything, we wouldn't have free will. We'd be puppets." Warren chuckled. "Ah, free will. The classic escape route." A few students laughed, but Barron remained calm. "Let's follow that logic," Warren continued. "If a child gets sick and dies, is that just free will? If a man loses his wife in an accident, should he just shrug and say, 'Oh well, God didn't want to interfere'?" Barron exhaled, prepared for this argument. "That's not what I said. You're mixing up human choices with suffering. Some things happen because of people's decisions, violence, greed, injustice. Other things, like illness or accidents, remind us that life is fragile." Warren pounced. "Exactly. Fragile, random, chaotic, just like the universe. No divine plan, just chance." Barron shook his head. "No, just because life has suffering doesn't mean it has no meaning." The room grew quieter now. Even the students who had been laughing earlier were listening more carefully. "You keep asking why God doesn't stop bad things," Barron continued. "But let's flip the question. Why does anything good happen at all? Why do people love? Why do they forgive? Why do they sacrifice for others? If the world is just chaos, why do we fight for something better?" For a moment, Professor Warren was speechless. The usual rhythm of these debates, the professor setting a trap, the student stumbling, had been disrupted. Barron had flipped the script. Warren leaned forward, still holding on to his smirk, but clearly rattled. "You're dodging the point, Barron. You're talking about love and sacrifice like they prove something. But those things don't need a God. Humans are social creatures. We evolved to care about each other for survival. Altruism is just a biological function. Professor Warren leaned back against the podium, trying to regain his composure. For the first time, he seemed rattled, unsure of how to respond. Barron's words had cut through the air, leaving the room in an uncomfortable silence. Barron wasn't done yet. He had taken the debate to a place Warren hadn't anticipated, challenging the very foundation of his argument. He leaned forward and continued, his voice calm but unwavering. "All right," Barron said. "Let's test your idea. Let's say you're right. Everything we feel, love, kindness, selflessness, it's all just chemicals in our brains, something evolution wired into us. So, what happens when someone decides to ignore that wiring? When they choose to be selfish? When they hurt others just because they can?" Warren smirked again, but Barron pressed on. "Why does it matter if everything is random chance? If morality is something we invented, then why is one action right and another wrong? If a person kills for fun, they're just following their instincts, right? Just like someone who feeds the hungry." A few students frowned, exchanging glances, surprised by where this was going. Warren scoffed and tried to dismiss the challenge. "That's a false comparison. Societies create morality because it benefits the group. We punish murder because it destabilizes the community." Barron didn't back down. "So morality is just whatever works for the majority?" he asked. Warren shrugged. "More or less." Barron let the words hang in the air before asking, "Then was slavery moral when the majority supported it?" The room went completely silent. The tension was palpable. Warren's face hardened. "That's not what I said." Barron pressed on. "But it's what your argument suggests. If morality is just decided by the majority, then slavery, segregation, genocide, these things were all right at some point in history, just because most people accepted them. Is that what you believe?" A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even those who weren't religious seemed disturbed by Warren's stance. The professor hard times change us. Pain forces us to see what matters. It teaches us to love better, to live better. If God stopped all suffering, we wouldn't learn those things. Warren let out a dry laugh. "That's your argument? That suffering is good for us?" Barron shook his head. "No. Suffering is awful. Nobody wants it. But if we only judge God by whether he prevents pain, we're missing the bigger picture." Warren scoffed, trying to dismiss him. "And what bigger picture is that?" Barron exhaled slowly. "Look at history. The people who changed the world the most weren't the ones who had easy lives. They were the ones who suffered, who lost something, who were pushed down, who had every reason to quit, but didn't. Martin Luther King Jr. suffered. Harriet Tubman suffered. Viktor Frankl survived the Holocaust. Corrie ten Boom lost her family in a concentration camp, but spent the rest of her life spreading forgiveness." He paused, letting the words sink in. These weren't people who lived pain-free lives, but their suffering led them to something greater. The room was dead silent now. Even the students who had been skeptical were listening intently. Barron's voice remained steady. "If God stopped every bad thing from happening," he said, "we'd never know courage. We'd never know sacrifice. We'd never understand love in its fullest form, because real love is choosing to care, even when it hurts." Warren pressed his hands against the podium, gripping it tightly. His voice was quieter now, more vulnerable. "So, we're just supposed to accept suffering?" Barron shook his head. "No. We're supposed to fight against it, to bring good out of it, to be the hands and feet of the God we claim to believe in. That's the difference." Jessica swallowed hard. The tension in the room was palpable, but this time it wasn't discomfort. It was reflection. For the first time, the momentum in Warren's famous debates had shifted. The professor wasn't in control anymore. Warren let out a slow breath and pushed away from the podium, his usual smug grin gone. He seemed defeated, his arguments unraveled by Barron's calm, measured responses. The students were no longer just spectators. They were thinking, questioning, reflecting on the bigger picture. "All right, Barron," he said, his voice steady. "Let's say I grant you that suffering can have meaning. That still doesn't prove God exists. It just means people are resilient.